Snow whispered that night like it carried secrets too heavy for the stars. The forest lay still beneath a quilt of white, the world hushed into prayer. From a cabin that leaned against the wind as if weary from standing so long, a single thread of smoke climbed toward a bruised sky. Inside, Elder Maeve Halloway sat before her fire, her palms stretched toward the flame that barely warmed the ache in her bones. The kettle murmured on the hearth, the sound like soft weeping. She lifted it, poured water over dried pine needles and mint leaves, old remedies for old souls. The scent filled the small room, mingling with the sharp bite of winter that leaked through the walls. Maeve spoke to herself, though no one answered anymore. "Storm's turning mean," she whispered, voice rasped by silence. "Even the owls have gone quiet." Then came it, the sound that didn't belong. A faint scratching at the door, timid yet desperate. At first, she thought it the wind, but the second time, it carried breath, living, trembling breath. Maeve rose slowly, her knees protesting. She wrapped her shawl tight, each step deliberate, her shadow wavering on the cabin's log walls. When she opened the door, the world came rushing in, a gust of ice and snow, and behind it, two shapes collapsed at her feet. Dogs. One pale as milk under moonlight, the other dark and gaunt, eyes glinting with a wild, uncertain fear. They trembled, not from cold alone, but from something deeper, an echo of pain she recognized too well. "Mercy," she breathed, lowering herself to their level. "What poor souls has the night sent me now?" She let them in without another thought. The white one, young, almost luminous, pressed close to the fire the moment it caught sight of warmth. The dark one lingered near the threshold, muscles coiled, eyes darting toward escape. Maeve left the door open, a gesture of trust she hoped would mean something. Her cabin was humble, a bed built from pine, shelves lined with jars of herbs and dried roots, a single rocking chair worn smooth by years of solitude. She moved with quiet purpose, fetching an old quilt and wrapping it around the smaller dog. "Elior," she murmured, testing the sound of it on her tongue. "You'll be Elior. Light should have a name." The other dog refused her approach, growling low, not a threat, but a warning from a heart long betrayed. His fur was matted, one ear torn, a scar tracing the side of his face like a forgotten story. "And you," she said softly, "you'll be shade. Every light needs its shadow." When she finally closed the door, the storm howled against it, testing the seams. Inside, the fire cracked, a heartbeat steady and alive. Maeve sat again, her gaze shifting between the two creatures now claiming the edges of her world. Her mind drifted to the years when she'd been called upon for births, when her hands brought warmth and life into cold nights. That was before the whispers, before the town had turned its face away. She could still hear them, those voices like frost-bitten gossip. Witch. Curse-bearer. Child-stealer. When the fever took young Clara Venn years ago, it wasn't the sickness that killed the girl. It was the town's need to find someone to blame. And Maeve, living alone on the ridge, had been the easiest choice. Since then, no one came knocking, not for herbs, not for help. The silence had become her only companion. Now, with two strangers breathing by her fire, the loneliness cracked open like thin ice. Maeve watched as Elior, the white one, lifted his head and met her gaze. His eyes, clear amber, soft yet questioning, seemed to hold something familiar. Gratitude, or perhaps recognition. Shade, meanwhile, had settled by the door, muscles tense, guarding what little he had left of the world. The old woman reached for her tea but didn't drink. Instead she listened, to their breathing, to the hiss of snow at the windows, to her own pulse filling the hollow of her chest. Time slowed until it almost stopped, like the world had decided to hold its breath with her. Later, she tore a loaf of bread in two, placed small pieces near the dogs. Elior approached first, eating gently from her palm. Shade waited until she looked away before creeping forward. When his teeth brushed her fingers by accident, Maeve didn't flinch. "You're safe here," she whispered, though perhaps it was herself she was speaking to. The night deepened. The fire dimmed. Outside, the snow rose high against the cabin walls. Maeve moved to seal the shutters and caught sight of the valley below. A faint orange glow in the far distance. Fire. But not the kind that warmed. Something burned near the river trail, where no light should be. She frowned, lingered a moment, then turned away. Trouble traveled fast in these parts, carried by wind and rumor alike. By midnight, Elior slept curled at her feet. Shade stayed awake, eyes reflecting the firelight, ears twitching at sounds only he seemed to hear. Maeve lay in bed but did not rest. Dreams crept around her like smoke. Her husband Jonah, laughing by the same fire years ago, 2 hounds at his side. They'd vanished one winter's night chasing a deer into the storm. She'd never found their bodies, only the silence after. When she woke before dawn, both dogs were gone. Panic seized her chest, sharp and raw. She rose too quickly, clutching the edge of the table to steady herself. Then she heard it, the crunch of paws outside near the woodpile. She opened the door to find Elior dragging a fallen branch twice his size toward the cabin. Shade watching, tail wagging faintly in approval. Maeve laughed, a sound foreign to her own ears. "Bringing in firewood now, are we?" The dogs came back in, snow dusting their fur like ash. Elior leaned into her hand, warm and trusting. Shade hesitated, then allowed her to brush the ice from his coat. It was such a small thing, that trust, but it filled the room like light. As the day crept on, the forest thawed beneath weak sunlight. Maeve went about her chores, the dogs trailing behind. She hummed an old song, her mother's tune, soft as breath. The dogs seemed to listen. Shade even barked once, short and uncertain, as if trying to join in. But peace, she knew, never lasted long in Winter Hollow. Far below the ridge, men were talking, voices sharp, clipped, filled with the urgency of law. Sheriff Calder Venn, the girl's brother, now wore guilt like a badge beneath his star. He stood in the snow outside the charred remains of a hunter's cabin. 2 bodies lay beneath white sheets. Near them, paw prints, one light, one heavy, led north toward the mountains. "Dogs," a deputy said. "Big ones. Savage from the look of it." Calder stared at the tracks disappearing into the wilderness. Something in him stirred. A memory of another winter, another loss. He remembered Maeve's hands once saving his sister when the fever first struck. Remembered her voice steady as the world shook around them. And then he remembered the day she was blamed. How he hadn't spoken up. He turned to his men. "We follow the tracks," he said quietly. "But keep your rifles low. These ain't ordinary strays." By evening, the storm began to rise again. The wind clawed at Maeve's windows. She fed the fire higher, feeling an unease she couldn't name. The dogs were restless, Elior pacing, Shade growling low. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a crow called, the sound cutting through the snow like a blade. Maeve sat in her chair, hands clasped over her knees, eyes on the door. She thought of the glow she'd seen last night, of the fire in the valley, of men with torches and reasons to hate. She felt the old ache return, the kind that came before loss. As dusk swallowed the light, Elior pressed close to her side. Shade stood guard near the window, head tilted, listening. Maeve stroked the white dog's fur and murmured, "If ghosts walk this mountain, I reckon we've all been one. Outside, unseen but near." Boots broke through the crust of snow, men climbing, breath harsh, rifles slung. The sheriff among them, his heart heavy, his conscience colder than the wind. Inside, the dogs stilled at once, sensing what she could not yet see. Maeve rose and crossed to the window. Through the falling snow, faint lanterns bobbed between the trees. Dozens. She didn't tremble. Instead, she reached for the latch and whispered to the dogs, "Hush now. Whatever comes, we face it together." The wind pressed hard against the cabin's walls, and in that moment the fire flared as though the storm itself had drawn breath. Outside, voices called her name through the snow. Maeve closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all the winters behind her, and said softly, "Jonah, if you can hear me, keep them safe." The cabin creaked. The dogs waited. The knock on the door came once, sharp and final, splitting the silence in two, and the old woman, without fear, turned toward it, ready. Morning came slowly, a pale hush seeping through the cracks of the shuttered windows. The world outside was all frost and silence, the storm spent but heavy with aftermath. Elder Maeve Halloway stood before her hearth, hands trembling slightly as she fed the fire. The dogs pressed close, Elior with his soft golden eyes, Shade still wary but unwilling to stray far from her side. They sensed something approaching. Their ears flicked toward the door long before the sound reached her. Boots, crunching through the snow. Voices low and deliberate. Then came a man's command, deep as thunder rolling across a frozen valley. Maeve closed her eyes, already knowing who it was. When the knock came again, it wasn't timid. 3 firm raps, the sort made by someone who had decided their duty outweighed their heart. She opened the door. Sheriff Calder Venn stood in the pale morning light, breath ghosting in the cold. Behind him, men from Winter Hollow held rifles, their faces twisted not by hate but by something worse, fear dressed as righteousness. Calder lowered his hat, eyes catching hers. "Maeve," he said quietly, "I need to come in." Her voice barely carried. "If you're here to accuse, do it by the fire." My bones are too old to stand judgment in the cold. He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, snow melting off his boots. The others waited outside, shifting, murmuring. The dogs tensed. Elior moved close to Maeve's skirt, but Shade stood between her and Calder, a silent sentinel. I heard what they're saying, she murmured, watching the sheriff's gloved hand rest on his holster. 2 men dead by the river. You think my guest did it? Calder's jaw worked. Their prints were all over the place. One white, one black. The bodies were torn apart. Nobody else could have done it. Maeve's expression didn't waver. You think beasts kill for cruelty's sake? Men do that, Sheriff. Not creatures running from hunger and fear. He studied her. How steady she stood. How the dogs didn't growl unless his eyes lingered too long. The fire snapped between them, casting gold over her lined face. He saw there not witchcraft, but weariness. The kind that comes from too many winters lived alone. The town's afraid, he said at last. They remember Clara. Her lips pressed thin. They remember what they chose to believe. Silence spread, wide and heavy. Outside, a crow called once, the sound cutting through the stillness like truth itself. Calder turned slightly, seeing the cabin's sparse order, the neat shelves, the folded quilts, the careful hands of a woman who never let despair turn to decay. I didn't come to hurt you, he said softly, but I can't ignore what's been done. Maeve moved to the table and lifted a kettle, poured him a cup of pine tea as if he were an old friend. You came because your conscience wouldn't let you send another man, she said, and because, deep down, you know mercy when you see it. Calder didn't drink. His gaze drifted to the dogs. Elior sat calmly, tail curled neatly around his paws. Shade watched every movement, his eyes alert, his body a wire of tension. The sheriff crouched slowly, offering his hand. Easy, he whispered. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Elior sniffed his fingers, leaning forward with quiet trust. Shade held back. His breath fogged the air between them like smoke from a barely burning fire. Calder saw the scar across the dark one's flank, the twisted tissue of an old wound. He lowered his voice even more. Someone hurt you bad, didn't they? Maeve's voice floated behind him. The world isn't kind to what it doesn't understand. Calder stood again. Outside, his men shifted, impatient, the sound of boots crunching snow. One shouted, Sheriff! You need us in there? No. He barked back, then steadied his tone. Stand down. Maeve watched him closely. They won't stay calm for long. Fear burns faster than wood, he sighed. You could let me take them. Say they wandered here, that you didn't know. I'll find a place, somewhere safe. Her laughter was small, brittle as frost. You think safety comes from chains? From cages? They found me because they remembered home, Sheriff. You'd take that from them? The words hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. Calder's face softened, lines of regret etching deeper. The firelight made him look older, more human. He removed his gloves and rubbed his palms, perhaps just to warm them, perhaps to steady the tremor of guilt. A noise shattered the quiet, an angry shout outside, followed by the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. The dogs lunged toward the window, barking. Shade's snarl filled the room. Maeve's heart leapt into her throat. Stay inside! Calder shouted, storming to the door. But it was too late. One of the deputies, young and scared, had already fired into the air. The crack echoed across the frozen trees, and in that instant, everything broke. Elior bolted forward, protective instinct overtaking fear. Maeve cried out, reaching. But the white blur was already past her, out into the storm-bright yard. Shade followed, a shadow streaking behind light. Calder cursed and ran after them, shouting orders drowned by barking and panic. The townsmen staggered back as the dogs circled, not attacking, defending. Elior stood in front of the cabin door, growling low, while Shade flanked the side, his teeth bared. Snow swirled around them, a furious dance of wind and white. Hold your fire, Calder roared, his voice carrying authority and pleading all at once. He stepped between the rifles and the dogs. They're protecting her, not hunting us. No one moved. For a breath, the entire world seemed frozen. Then a single drop of blood fell into the snow, not from man or beast, but from Elior's paw, sliced by ice. Maeve appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her voice steady. They mean no harm. Put your guns down for God's sake. Her courage broke the tension like dawn breaking over frost. The men lowered their rifles slowly, shame creeping through the crowd. The sheriff stood motionless, his breath heavy in the cold. Elior limped to Maeve's side. She knelt, cradling him, murmuring softly. Shade pressed close, eyes fixed on the men who'd called him a monster. Calder looked around at his deputies, at the faces of the town that had feared shadows for far too long. Then he turned to Maeve. You were right, he said quietly. Fear's a poor compass. She met his gaze, something fragile yet fierce flickering there. Mercy's the better map, he nodded once. Then let mercy be the law today. No one argued. Slowly, one by one, the townsmen turned back down the ridge, their lanterns dimming into distance. The snow began to fall again, gentler now, as if the mountain itself exhaled in relief. Inside the cabin, Maeve cleaned Ellier's wound by the fire. The dog rested his head on her knee, eyes half closed. Shade lay nearby, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm of trust restored. Calder stood by the door, hat in his hands, as though unsure what to do next. You could stay a while? Maeve said softly, without looking up. Warm yourself. The cold out there doesn't forgive easy. He hesitated. You'd have me after what I nearly brought to your door? I've forgiven worse, she said. And you've seen enough ghosts for one morning. He smiled faintly, weary and genuine. Maybe I have. When he finally sat beside her, it was in silence. The crackle of fire filled the spaces where apology might have lived. Outside, the storm had softened to a lullaby. Calder's gaze drifted across the small room, to the wooden mantel where a few keepsakes rested. A worn locket, a small carving of 2 dogs. He reached for it, then stopped. Your husband? He asked quietly. Maeve nodded. Jonah carved that. He had 2 hounds, Elior and Shade. Lost them in a storm years back. Calder froze, the realization dawning slow and bright. He turned to the dogs now sleeping near the fire, the way their names fit too perfectly, their instincts too familiar. Maeve, he said, his voice breaking into wonder. You're telling me? They found their way home, she finished, not smiling, not crying, simply knowing. Some souls don't stay lost, not if love remembers them. Calder leaned back, unable to speak. Outside, the sky began to lighten, the first blush of dawn spreading across the snow. Inside, the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a promise. That warmth, once shared, never truly leaves. Maeve reached out, brushing a stray ember from Elior's fur. You came looking for beasts, Sheriff, she said softly. But what you found was faith. He nodded slowly, his voice low. And maybe forgiveness too. As the light grew stronger, he rose, placing his hat back on his head. I'll tell them the trail went cold, he said. Let them rest here in peace. She stood, eyes shining faintly in the firelight. Thank you, Calder Ven. May the snow be gentle on your road. He paused at the door, looking back one last time. The scene behind him, an old woman, 2 loyal hounds, a hearth burning bright against winter's gray, etched itself deep in his memory, like the ending of a story too sacred to retell. When he stepped outside, the cold bit at his face, but it no longer felt cruel. He followed the path down the ridge, his footprints vanishing almost as soon as they were made. Inside, Maeve whispered to the dogs, her voice soft as prayer. Rest now, my darlings. The world's finally quiet. The wind stirred, carrying the faintest echo of a man's laughter. Jonah's, perhaps, woven through the sigh of pines. The fire flared once more before settling into calm. If you wander through Winter Hollow, they still say her cabin glows at dusk, a single light burning through the snow. Some claim they hear 2 dogs barking faintly, not in warning, but in welcome. And sometimes, when the night is very still, an old woman's voice can be heard, whispering through the frost. When the world turns cold, open your door. What you let in might just save you.